It's always great to be around young people and to pick up on that energy, but increasingly when I'm around people of Will's age, I'm also reminded that I'm not. There's a young woman who started with our organization a short while back, and her manager or her supervisor brought her into my office just to make introductions, and I noticed her last name. I said, Pearson, like the Prime Minister. And she said, no, like the airport. It's one of many, many old man moments that I seem to be having. Before we get to my formal remarks, I also wanted to say thank you to Liz, but thank you to Tamarack and to Vibrant Communities, and mostly thank you to you folks. This has been wonderful for me. I booked vacation time so I could come to the conference, because this is important to me, but I also knew that I would meet fascinating people, people who were open and willing to share stories and wisdom, and you folks have done that on every single occasion. So I really want to thank you for enriching my experience and helping me better understand the country that we share. Liz obviously told you that most of my life has been spent telling stories. Less so now that I'm out of the newsroom and a business leader, but I'm going to tell a story today. So, Wayne was my best friend for most of my boyhood. He had an effortless laugh, and it was so easy to like him. He was the coolest guy that I knew. We were the same age, but Wayne was always the leader of our small band, having mastered all of the skills that boys deem essential. He could play Smoke on the Water on his guitar, and I still think Deep Purple is pretty cool. He could fillet a fish with a 3-inch pocket knife, and I know that's way cool. And perhaps most impressively, he could perfectly imitate the sounds of the most obscene bodily functions. And for sure, I know that's super cool. It must be. It remains a staple of almost all humor in the Robbins household. Don't judge us. As I said, I thought Wayne was the coolest guy in the world. But for all of my adoration, and despite his standing in our boyhood pantheon, there was always something tentative about Wayne. It was almost as if he never quite believed that he belonged in our group, let alone that he was as much of a hero to us as was obvious to everyone else. Like a dog that's been cuffed once too often, Wayne was oftentimes suspicious of an outstretched hand. And you had the sense that he expected at some point his friends would abandon him, as we one day would. I've shared Wayne's story with groups like this before. I shared it with readers of the Hamilton Spectator when I was still at the newspaper. And I've chosen to retell his story today because so much of my own thinking about poverty, and truthfully about life, begins with Wayne. I didn't recognize it at the time, of course. I was a boy. But Wayne was to be a seminal player in my life, informing my view of the world that would have surprised our teenage selves. I'm also sharing Wayne's story today because in my marrow, I know that after a lifetime in media, that all wisdom starts with the telling of stories. And that is why we're all here in Ottawa this week, to gain some wisdom about the poverty that blights our nation. And so I'll start with Wayne. Wayne was a poor kid in a poor neighborhood in a poor town. My own family was of modest means, even humble. But Wayne's family resided one entire precarious rung below us on the social ladder. The fact that Wayne was of mixed race was not by any means the sole determinant of his family's place in our tiny universe, but nor was it coincidental. And there is no question in my mind that it contributed to what I can only describe as the vicious indifference to Wayne and his siblings that was demonstrated by the community that we lived in. I don't think Wayne had more than one pair of jeans in all of the years that I knew him, and they were always dirty and torn. Wayne was a skinny kid, and he was always hungry, shamelessly scrounging leftovers from every friend that he visited. "You got anything to eat?" was his standard greeting. At home, there was no running water, there was no toilet. Sometimes there was no heat, and perhaps worst of all, there was never any hope. Wayne knew at an age when a child should not have such wisdom how fragile is life. Of the many sins that can be laid at poverty's door, surely none is greater than the vulnerability that it instills in people who have been brutalized by it. That nagging, sometimes suffocating fear that everything you have can be taken from you. As a child, I thought Wayne's place in the world was unfair. And I now appreciate, of course, that it was much worse than unfair, that it was scandalous, and it was an indictment of the country in which we both lived. Sadly, 40 years later, Canada still stands accused. In fact, the gap between the rich and the poor in our country, not just in Canada but around the globe, has only grown over those 4 decades. More than 1 million Canadian children live in poverty. Think about that. 1 million Canadian children who, as we sit here today, are learning the lessons that Wayne learned. That the world is mostly indifferent to them, that they're not deserving of anything better, and that what little they have can be taken from them. 1 million children are learning that lesson as we sit here. Oxfam made headlines this past January when it reported that the 80 richest people in the world control as much wealth as half the world's population combined. 80 people. No surprise then that polls show that Canadians of every political stripe, and I want to underline every political stripe and come back to that in a moment, now identify income inequality as a significant issue facing our country. In one study by the Broadbent Institute, 85% of Canadians express strong support for government action to address income inequality. Consider the enormity of that for a moment. 85% and of every political stripe. Income inequality has become an issue that bridges political ideology at a time when God knows precious few things do. Canadians once fancied our nation had embarked upon the great enterprise of building a just society. And I do believe that's still very much in our DNA and reflected in the poll that I just referred to. And it informs how we respond to issues like income inequality and poverty. Liz mentioned in her introductions that I spent a fair chunk of my career at the Hamilton Spectator. I kind of grew up there, actually. And I had the privilege to lead the news team and then subsequently to lead the newspaper as its publisher. I've since left the Spectator. I'm still with the same company, with Metroland Media, a division of Tourist Star. But I want to take you back to that Saturday that Liz referred to. It was October 29th, of 2005, when I was the Spectator's editor-in-chief, when we published that blank page. Earlier this morning, someone here asked me about the bravery required to do that, and I had to truthfully admit, I don't think I actually appreciated how brave it was until my phone started ringing. Then apparently I was really brave. As you'd heard, on that day, the Hamilton Spectator published a blank front page, something that, of course, it had never done in its then 160-year history, and to the best of my knowledge, no other newspaper has done. And that message, and I'll just read it to you again, because it really encapsulated the mandate that our newspaper set for itself. The stories have been removed from this page to remind us that nearly 100,000 children, women, and men live in poverty in Hamilton, people whose stories rarely make the front page. We're going to change that. And we did. In the years that have followed, the Spectator has devoted unprecedented journalistic resources to telling Hamilton's poverty story, punctuated with a series of special reports called Code Red, a unique journalistic exploration of the relationship between poverty and health. Code Red is, and I say is, not was, because it continues to be a living project, is the work of an extraordinary journalist who I would pay homage to here. His name is Steve Buist. If you are not familiar with Steve's work on poverty, you need to make yourself familiar with it, because Steve has done more to further our understanding of poverty's impact on the health of Canadians than any reporter in the country. I've been proud to call a lot of reporters my colleagues over the years, but none more so than Steve Buist. But back to that front page. With that front page, we were making a very, very public declaration that our newspaper found the prevalence of poverty in our community to be both offensive and unacceptable, that poverty, in our estimation, was the single largest issue confronting Hamilton, and the one upon which all others hinged, and that finally, as a media organization and as a corporate citizen, we were committing to help reduce poverty. That front page was the beginning of an odyssey, and I choose that word very deliberately for my newspaper and for myself as an individual. In the years since, as an editor, as a publisher, as a volunteer in our community, I spent a lot of time thinking about poverty and its impact on our country. I should have put this in my intro. I claim no wisdom. I claim no wisdom. I have no great insights for you. But I have become convinced of a couple things over all of those years of reflection and study. And I'd ask you that as I share them with you to be mindful that I see them through the prism of a lifetime working in mass media. My first thought is that we are undermined in our efforts to generate the needed societal will to truly tackle poverty by a surprising dichotomy. We're buffeted by two significant and seemingly contrary headwinds. The first is the dearth of Canadians who have experienced poverty firsthand. The second is the abundance of Canadians who have experienced poverty firsthand. Let me try to tease some logic out of those apparently contradictory statements. In the case of the former, the majority of Canadians that have followed mine have mostly known only affluence. And increasingly that is transforming us into a society that is not rooted in personal knowledge of poverty, or in many cases even want. Make no mistake, undeniably one of the greatest strengths of our nation is the breadth and robustness of our middle class. And certainly that group has become the dominant political force in our country. Witness the endless courting of it by every political party, whether they are on the right, the left, or the center. However, what's often missed in the discussion of the middle class is any acknowledgement that the middle class of today is not the middle class of yesterday. My father, who I spoke about at a workshop yesterday, ended his life proudly proclaiming to be middle class. That was a badge of honor for my dad. Now, having had to settle his estate, I can tell you that was mostly aspirational, maybe not necessarily rooted in truth. But Dad was proud to be middle class. He counted himself among the people who had made it. But that is not where my father's life started or where he spent most of it. He grew up in grinding poverty on a hard-scrabble farm that couldn't even feed his family. As an adult, his fortunes improved somewhat. But for Dad's entire working life, it was an exhausting, bone-crushing struggle to provide for his own family, for my mother, myself, and my brother. Not surprisingly, there was nothing my father... I always tell people that my father was the bravest man I've ever known. I don't think anything frightened him. But I know that's not true. There was one thing that terrified Dad. He would never have said this. He would never have articulated this. He lived in horror of losing his job. He lived in horror of losing his job because he always knew that he was one paycheck from having his children experience the life that he had hoped he had locked forever in the past. My dad was devastatingly ashamed to have grown up poor. That was an awful part of his life that he wanted to have locked away. And the notion that by losing his job, that box would open up again was something that terrified him. My father, like so many of his generation, graduated to the middle class. But that's not where he started, and it's not what informed his worldview. Now contrast that with my family. My children were born into the middle class. They live in what I consider an idyllic suburban neighborhood, populated with other middle-class families. My children have never wanted for anything. It was a sort of a revelation for me in one of those Jacob conversations when I realized that my children had traveled more by the time they were 16 than I had by the time I was 40. Marinenshi said much that was inspiring yesterday, but at the top of my list was one comment. I saw a number of you writing it down. It said, quote, "There is one thing that makes Canada successful. We've discovered a simple truth, that we're all in it together." What a powerful statement. And he's right, of course. I take no issue with that claim. Canadian society is fundamentally a caring culture. Witness the outpouring of support anytime there's disaster anywhere in the world, Nepal most recently. But I would nuance that with the observation that it's a caring culture, but increasingly it is not informed by that there but for the grace of God sensibility that informed it in previous generations. We feel sorry for the poor, sometimes even as we judge them, but we can't really figure out how is it that they came to be poor. I'm going to pick on my own children again. This is not just a father speaking. You have to take me at my word when I tell you that they are smart, caring, thoughtful young people, even Jacob. Well, not always Jacob, but mostly Jacob. They are. I'm immensely proud of my kids. They have very sound values. Very sound values, sometimes expressed differently than their parents, but very sound values. So they are truly good people. But poverty is as foreign a landscape to them as the lunar surface. I've been dining out on a story at the expense of my daughter Nicola for years, to her mortification. So I'm going to do it again. When Nikki was 16, I came home from work one day to discover her embroiled in an argument. That's a nice euphemism that covers a lot of parenting territory, right? An argument with her mother, her long-suffering mother. The details aren't important, but essentially Nikki was complaining about how utterly miserable her life was under the reign of terror in our home. And she said, I can't imitate a teenage girl's voice, so you'll have to bear with me. She said, I wish I'd grown up when you grew up. You were so lucky. You had so much freedom. So I did what every parent does when confronted by a belligerent teen. I played for guilt. So I, in my most self-pitying voice, said, lucky? Nikki, how can you say that to Dad? You know I grew up in a trailer. And Nick, without missing a beat, says, that's right. Your house had wheels under it. You were always going places. Not to that moment had I appreciated the advantages of living in a trailer. I tell you that story mostly for a cheap laugh at the expense of one of my children. Actually, that's the only reason I tell you that story. If you can't laugh at your kids, right? But the serious reason I tell you that story is because even for really good, thoughtful people, people whose hearts are in the right place, it's very difficult to understand poverty if you've never experienced it. The best intentioned, most caring individuals feel sympathy for the poor, but the experience doesn't really resonate. It lacks emotional traction. And I'm going to suggest to you that sympathy is dangerous. Sympathy marginalizes. If we're going to make real inroads in poverty reduction, we need empathy, not sympathy. Empathy is what prompts action and change. After a lifetime in media, I can tell you with 100% certainty that the stories with which readers and viewers most oftentimes connect are those in which they can see some small part of their life reflected. An empathetic community, an empathetic country, is a powerful tool in our battle against poverty. So that was our first. Paradoxically, if the lack of personal experience with poverty is an obstacle with younger Canadians, the abundance of personal experience with poverty is as great an obstacle with the generations that preceded them. The experience of people in middle age, people of my generation, who have known poverty even tangentially, distorts their perception and understanding of poverty in contemporary Canadian society. In many cases, it gives people of my generation a misplaced confidence that they understand the experience of poverty and the dynamics of it. And I don't think most of us do. I used to tell people that I had grown up poor. I'm embarrassed, especially in a room like this, to admit that I have ever made that claim. I feel a bit like the guy who reads the book review and then pretends to have read the book. The truth is that as challenged as my family's fortunes may have been, my own experience in childhood does not resonate with the experience of poverty today. And perhaps it never did. It's never been good to be poor. Being poor is always the short end of the stick. But the truth is that to experience poverty in contemporary Canadian society is to experience a poverty that is particularly corrosive and marginalizing. Marginalizing in a way that wasn't true even a generation ago, or at least not to the same degree. There are many reasons I'd argue why being poor today is worse than being poor when I was growing up, but I think there are a couple factors worth noting here. One is the increasing polarization of Canadian society. For Canadians of my generation, whether you were growing up poor, rich, or somewhere in between, you almost certainly rub shoulders with folks of all social stripes. And you enjoyed frequent windows into their lives. When the local dentist's son, any of you from small town, you know, like the dentist is like the king, right? Like that's as high on the social strata as you can get in small towns. When the local dentist's son turned 8, I was invited to his birthday party. I was invited even though my dad worked underground in the mines and my mom waited tables at a diner. And let's not forget, I had the tremendous good fortune to live in a house with wheels. No one would have thought it odd that I palled around with the dentist's son. No one would have thought it odd that I was invited to his birthday party. His mom served a red velvet birthday cake. It was the first time I'd ever seen a cake that wasn't chocolate or vanilla. And inside she'd baked dimes and nickels wrapped in wax paper. I don't want to think about the choking hazard, but cake, money, and ice cream all on one plate. I can distinctly remember thinking, rich people have way better cakes. Baking nickels into a cake. You got to have special insurance to do that, I think. That kind of social interaction, that cohesion, is appreciably less common today, especially in the large cities where most Canadians live, where it's become quite possible for a poor child to have no meaningful contact with anyone other than other poor children. I think it's hard in 2015 for most Canadians to understand how small your world can be if you were a poor child growing up in a poor neighborhood. I think the second factor aggravating contemporary poverty is a bit harder to get our intellectual arms around. And I'm talking about the increase in personal wealth in Canadian society over the past 2 generations. So much affluence, so much conspicuous consumption that at times I find it hard to recognize the society that I live in. To be clear, I'm not talking about the 1%. We love to talk about the 1%. I'm not talking about the 1%, the super rich whose charming excesses have been with us since time immemorial. This isn't about the Kardashians. I'm talking about the middle class. Those of us who sustain all the trendy restaurants along Spark Street and in the market, who drive real estate prices to unbelievable heights, and who apparently don't blink in the face of $5 lattes. So much focus on the 1%, but the tail that wags the dog is the middle class. So how does all of that affluence make poverty more corrosive? It's the juxtaposition, I suppose. And with apologies to Charles Dickens and Scrooge, it is when abundance rejoices that want is felt most keenly. I'm not saying it's easier to be poor when those around you are also impoverished, but it is true that to be poor when those around you are affluent, perhaps to excess, is particularly corrosive and damaging and ultimately weakens the fabric of our society. As I said, I don't claim to have gained any great wisdom about poverty in the years since Wayne and I used to throw stones from the Howie Bay Bridge, but I've become convinced of a few things. Recently, I had the good fortunes to meet Joe Roberts, the so-called Skid Row CEO. If you're not familiar with Joe's story, he spent most of his youth addicted to heroin and living under bridges in Vancouver. Joe's journey from homeless drug addict to successful entrepreneur and tireless advocate for impoverished youth, is a remarkable one. When I met Joe, he said two things that stuck with me for days after. First, he said, if you are in the hope business, you will never go out of business. And I like that. I like that here because I think we're all in the hope business, and it speaks to the resiliency of the people who are in this room. And I applaud you for that. The second thing that Joe said, and the one that I think is perhaps directly on point today, is he said, quote, none of us changes until we are backed into a corner. None of us changes until we are backed into a corner. And so my question to you is, how do we convince the people outside this room that poverty has backed our nation into a corner? How do we convince them that change is essential? In the same way that a generation ago, as a society, we said, drunk driving is unacceptable. Male violence against women is unacceptable. How do we reach that same societal consensus that systemic entrenched poverty is beyond the Canadian pale? And how do we do that? How do we do that without getting mired in the worn-out, threadbare ideologies and tired class arguments that have held this conversation hostage for generations? I'm going to suggest a way. Anytime someone poses a question, you know they're going to answer it, right? I'm going to suggest a way that we might nudge the conversation in a different direction. At the top of my remarks, I referred to Steve Buse and his work on Code Red. Steve spent more than 3 years working on the first installment of Code Red, which started with a simple question. What is the relationship between health and income in Hamilton? To answer that, Steve worked in conjunction with a great team at McMaster University and did something that had never before been done in Canada. He took 400,000 health records generated by every death, birth, emergency room admission in Hamilton over a 2-year period, and then mapped the results against Hamilton's neighborhoods. This is what Steve found. There is a 21-year gap in life expectancy between Hamilton's richest and poorest neighborhood. A 21-year gap in life expectancy. In our poorest neighborhood, life expectancy is 65 years. And to put that in some global context, if that neighborhood was a country, it would rank 165th in the world. 7 neighborhoods in Hamilton have higher incidence of low birth weight babies than sub-Saharan Africa. 7 neighborhoods in southern Ontario, in arguably the most affluent region of a most affluent country, have higher incidence of low birth weight babies than sub-Saharan Africa. Residents in one neighborhood, slammed up tight against the industrial heart, had 1,300 emergency room visits for every 1,000 people. Neighborhoods like mine generally have less than 100. 1,300 for every 1,000 people. The neighborhoods with the 10 highest rates of psychiatric-related emergencies are all located in a single square in the downtown. Finally, I want to tell you about one particular neighborhood, and it has the unsexy name in the mapping data of CT0050. It's small, little better than half a kilometer square, but home to about 4,500 people. Of the 130 neighborhoods in Hamilton, it ranked dead last. CT0050 finished among the bottom 10 neighborhoods in 14 of the 24 categories that we measured, including 8 of the 12 health categories. It had the highest rate of urgent care hospital admissions, the second highest rate of high school dropout, and the third highest rates of emergency room visits and overall hospital admissions. More than 40% of the children in CT0050, live in poverty, 40%. That neighborhood was a 5-minute drive from my very nice office at the Hamilton Spectator. 5 minutes. And it's only 15 minutes from the neighborhood where I raised my children. Even as I say that to you today, I have difficulty reconciling the existence of those two different worlds, separated by mere kilometers. But here's something else I know. CT0050 exists in every community that's here today. Code Red was not, as some people thought, about poor people in Hamilton. It's about the impact of poverty on the health of Canadians. And ultimately, I think the most important contribution that Code Red made to the poverty debate in our city was that it allowed us to adopt a different vocabulary, to change our lexicon. All these years we've been talking about poverty, when I'd argue we should have been talking about health. What did we hear this week from Stephen Huddard? At least 20% of all of our healthcare spending is on disease rooted in poverty. Or perhaps more simply, as Senator Eglinton put it, poverty makes us sick. Health, for a whole lot of reasons, is an issue Canadians understand. We have a very broad, rock-solid consensus on health, and in some ways, an uncomplicated expectation of equity in health outcomes. Little of the moral and intellectual ambiguity that so oftentimes confuses poverty discussions. Indeed, I don't know that I've ever met a Canadian who would argue that any one segment of our population should have wildly degraded health outcomes. But that's, of course, exactly what Code Red showed us. From conception, poor Canadians suffer health outcomes significantly poorer than other Canadians, and in many cases rivaling those in the third world. Code Red was really about a modern-day plague. Not AIDS, not SARS, not Ebola. It was about poverty, which will degrade the health of more Canadians than all of those other diseases combined. And so that's the guidance I'd offer. We live in the most narcissistic age in our history, one increasingly defined by our inability to empathize with those around us. If we're going to change that, we need to find a different entry point into the poverty conversation. And I would argue that maybe that entry point is health. Ironically, one of the last times I saw Wayne, he was in hospital. Bloodied and horribly and permanently disfigured and barely able to speak just hours after a particularly gruesome suicide attempt. He was still just a boy. Just a boy, but his life had taken a turn from which there could be no recovery. There were a couple more encounters between myself and Wayne, but the centrifugal force of his life spiraling out of control soon spun myself and the whole old gang out of his life. And the very thing that Wayne had always feared, being abandoned by his friends, the people who offered that sliver of a window into another life, had come to pass. The door slammed shut with Wayne on one side and us on the other. Over the years, I've heard snippets now and then, health problems, a failed marriage, years of addiction, and Wayne's ever-present companion, poverty. And I wish Wayne's story had a different ending. But the legacy of poverty is rarely edifying. Wayne, the adult, is a stranger to me now. But Wayne, the boy, expert fisherman and builder of forts, is much on my mind. And so too are the million Canadian children who are following Wayne's path. Thank you for your time today.